Good morning, Year 9. Come in and get settled. Remember where you're sitting in the seating plan. If you have any trouble remembering, just let me know and I can help. Once you're seated, have a look at the board and see what you will need for today's lesson and get prepared. Make sure you write down the learning goals in your workbooks and remember laptops down unless I tell you it's time to use them. Okay, let me just mark the roll while you get settled and then we can begin. The roll is then marked. So Year 9, let's start with a recap of last lesson for those who weren't here. Who can tell me what we did last lesson? Remember, we have two categories to know what we did. Historical knowledge, so what did we learn about the movement of people in history, and historical skills, so what skills did we develop during the lesson? I'll write these recaps up on the whiteboard, and if you weren't here, or if you feel that you need a bit of a refresher, take some notes. And if you want to come to me at the end of the lesson for a bit more information, if you still aren't sure, then I will be here and I can give you any work you may not have completed yet. I would then get the student recap using prompting questions to stimulate student engagement. Okay, that is a wonderfully thorough recap for us. So today, to build on what we've already learned and to begin to prepare us for our exam at the end of term, we're going to be looking at how we evaluate sources. We'll do a few lessons on this concept as it can be a tricky one to do well, and I will start by walking you through the evaluation process. So next lesson you will work in groups to evaluate sources, and finally you will complete some evaluations on your own so that I can give you some feedback and ensure that everyone knows how to evaluate sources well. Now, can anyone tell me why this is an important skill for us to learn this term? Yes, that's right. Your assessment this term is a response to sources exam, which means that you will have to evaluate sources in exam conditions and construct a historical argument based off those sources. So this skill is very important for you to understand well. Before we begin, can anyone tell me what evaluating a source does for us? How can it help our historical inquiry? Yeah, that's right. We evaluate a source to determine its reliability. Anything else? Yep, we can also evaluate a source to work out if it will be useful for us to support our argument. Let's turn our eyes to the PowerPoint and get ready to learn how to evaluate sources. Okay, so there are three main things we need to consider when we are evaluating a source. They are origin, purpose, and context. Make sure you get this down, okay? The origin is the when, where, and who wrote the source. It can also include who the source was made for. All of these elements influence the type of source and how reliable or useful it is for our study. So learning the origin of the source can show us what? Who can fill in the blanks on the slide? Totally. It will tell us whether a source is primary or secondary. Can anyone remind us what makes a source primary? Yeah, that's right. A primary source is written in the time period it is describing by someone who was present there. It's a first-hand account. What then classifies a secondary source? Yeah, a secondary source was written after the event. Here I would pause to let students take notes and wander the classroom while they do so. Wonderful, Year 9. Make sure you write down these points. Okay, next, the purpose of a source. This is what we consider when evaluating sources. Why was the source created, and was it to inform or persuade? I've provided some examples of types of sources that would inform or persuade. Can anyone think of any other types of sources that would generally do those things? What would a photograph do? Could a photograph do both, possibly? So maybe sometimes it depends on the specific source. Here I would pause again to let students take notes and wander the classroom again. Okay, get that down. Is everyone keeping up or do I need to slow down? Wonderful. Context. The context is the situation a source was created in, the time and place. When we think about context, we need to think about what major historical events were happening at the time and in the place it was created. We put the source in the context or its creation rather than looking at it in an isolated view. For example, any sources created in the 18th century, we would have to consider that they were created in a time when slavery was legal and when technological advancements had boomed due to the Industrial Revolution, a time when the world was expanding and new ideas were everywhere. Let's have a think as you get that down. What would historians in the future have to consider about any sources created in the year 2021? What are some key events happening now in Australia that could influence sources? Yes, COVID-19 is a massive one. Also the Black Lives Matter movement, Me Too movement, and the fight against climate change. So many things today can influence sources. Here I would pause again to let students take more notes and wander the classroom again. Okay, make sure you have all of that down year 9, and then let's look at some examples. I have already evaluated these sources, but want you to help me determine which source is the most reliable and which could be more useful to me if I was to write an essay using these sources. Here is source number 1. Can I get a volunteer to read it out? Thank you. Allow student time to read the source and description. Wonderful job. So here is my evaluation of the source. It was written by Mary Prince, a West Indian slave in 1831 in England, for British people to read to understand the truth about slavery. That is its origin. Its purpose was to inform, but as it is a personal account, it could hold some bias, which we should take into account. And finally, the context. It's a personal account of slavery in the 18th century, the time period where slavery was widespread and still legal, and it recounts the experience of being sold. Can we think of any other things to add to the source's origin, context, or purpose? Here, I would pause to allow students to respond. That's great. So overall, what are our thoughts on this source? Reliable or not? Again, pause for responses. Let's move on to the next. Can I get a volunteer to read this source? Thank you. Here I would pause again for the student to read the source. Okay, so let's have a look at my evaluation. It was written by the Union in 1837 for citizens of the North in America. So back when America was divided between the North and South. Its purpose was to incite citizens to attend a lecture against slavery in protests. To protest in support of slavery. Do we all know what incite means? No? It means to encourage and stir up action for or against something. So in this case, to encourage action against people trying to outlaw slavery. Finally, its context was before the American Civil War, when the anti-slavery movement began to gain popularity. How could this have influenced its reliability? Here I would pause for student responses. Okay, year 9, make sure you have all of this recorded, and then let's come to a conclusion as a class as to which source is more reliable and which is more useful. I would pause for students to finish taking notes. So, who thinks that source 1 is more reliable? Hands up. Okay, who thinks source 2 is more reliable? Great. Who is ready to justify their answer? Yeah? Here I would pause for student responses, adding to responses and encouraging deeper evaluation and justification. So our final conclusions then are that source 1 may be more reliable because it is a first-hand primary account of slavery, whereas source 2 is trying to influence people into believing something. That is a great evaluation. Now, which source is more useful? Here I would pause again for student responses, adding to responses, and again encouraging deeper evaluation and justification. That is great, year 9. You have identified something really important. It depends on our research question and what we are trying to prove as to the usefulness of the sources. So if we were investigating the impact of slavery on generations of African people, we would use source 1. And if we were investigating the attitudes of people to slavery in the lead up to the American Civil War, we would use that source. Great evaluation. You've all worked really well today, and I think that next lesson you should all be well prepared to evaluate some sources in pairs. Before you pack up and go to break, I just need each of you to complete an exit ticket. I want you to shut your books and write down from memory the steps you need to use to evaluate a source. There are 3 things. Remember to write down what aspects you have to consider in each step. Once you've done that, you may pack up quietly and leave the classroom. Thank you for your wonderful work today and have a great rest of your day.